Hello, everyone, and happy Thursday. Welcome to Something to Talk About Live. My name is Jamie Hinkle. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Learning and Inclusion Manager at PFLAG National. Just like every other week, if you've joined us in the past, my job right now is to introduce you all to Jean Marie Nevada, who is going to lead our conversation today.
Hey, Jamie.
Hey, happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day to you. I wanted to have a tree with me that I could hug for this event, but it wasn't really working out because I live in the desert and all we have are cactuses.
Yeah, well, I took off tomorrow and Monday so that I can go be in nature for the weekend and see maybe a waterfall or two.
So maybe you can hug a tree on my behalf.
Yeah, I think I can make that happen.
Excellent. Well, we will see you in a little while because this is a fun conversation and I know you're coming back to be part of it towards the end. So hello, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Nevada. My pronouns are she and her, or ella if you speak Spanish. And I am the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. And every single week we get together to have a conversation about something relevant and connected to people who are LGBTQ and LGBTQ issues. So if you would like to pick up this week's article, actually we have 3 articles, but we're going to be using one as our jumping off point. You should go to straightforequality.org/discussion series. And, Jamie and I have been making our jokes about tree hugging, but Earth Day is actually really, really an important day. And a lot of people in our LGBTQ space don't always connect it as an LGBTQ issue. And in fact, it very, very much is. So the article that we're using today was in Green Matters, and it was Sophie Hirsch wrote about a drag queen, Patagonia, who brought drag diversity to the climate movement. And the article's really fascinating. Essentially, it's about how one drag queen put on her hiking boots with high heels, thankfully. And that was the beginning of bringing this conversation to a new audience. And when we think about why sustainability and the environment is a queer issue, well, we all live on the planet, so duh. But let me give you a couple of other reasons. First of all, we know that when there is climate change and climate challenges, those disproportionately affect people in low income brackets, as well as those who are homeless, which affects very specific portions of our community. Additionally, natural disasters displace people, and there is a correlation between queer people being displaced and increased levels of violence and discrimination. And connected to this also is the issue of food insecurity. A lot of people don't realize that people who are queer actually suffer from food insecurity at a rate of about 10% higher than those who are not queer, with those numbers much higher for people of color who are also queer. So this is very much an LGBTQ issue, but I want to go a little bit further into this and talk about why today is significant and what people need to be paying attention to. And to do that, of course, we have a great guest. I have Glen Hooks with us from the Sierra Club. And I just want to, hello, Glen. I need to read your bio to people because it made me giggle this morning when I was going through stuff. So you direct the Arkansas Sierra Club. You obsessively make perfect playlists for every imaginable situation, it seems.
I think
and you're a do-gooder in residence at the International House of Shenanigans.
That's right. You pulled up an older bio. Yeah, I've moved from the International House of Shenanigans, but we have fond memories of it, and we kind of recreate it when we were at my new home in North Little Rock. But yeah, the playlist thing is I think obsessively is the right word for it, but it always works out.
I like that. As a person who does believe there is a playlist for every mood, I am very into this. So before we actually get into the larger conversation, could you just tell people a little bit about what the Sierra Club does? I think people know environment, but could you be a little bit more specific?
Yeah, sure. The Sierra Club is the nation's oldest and largest environmental protection organization, an advocacy group. We have been around since 1892, and our mission is to explore, enjoy, and protect the planet. And so what we do is, as mentioned, we're an advocacy group. We lobby Congress, we lobby state legislatures, we work in administrative agencies, and we're a political organization too. So we endorse and support candidates who share our progressive environmental values as well. So we're definitely an action organization. We're a justice organization, and we've been doing this a long time. I love working here.
Thank you. So I want to begin moving this conversation to make it relevant to our connection to the LGBTQ community. So in your professional and personal experience, because you have a connection in this conversation, how do those connections for the fight for environmental justice and for LGBTQ justice intersect?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that issues of justice and oppression intersect all the time, right? Pretty much every single issue that the Sierra Club has ever worked on has multiple layers of oppression, which is kind of a mind-blowing concept for folks who think that they're just working on environmental issues. And it's my opinion that you can't really effectively work on environmental issues unless you are also caring about about justice and about your community. And so if we take the issue of climate disruption, for instance, something that really drives a lot of Sierra Club's work, that's on its surface a pollution issue for sure. It's also an environmental racism issue when we're talking about where power plants are sited and the disproportionate health impacts on Black and Brown communities. It's also an LGBTQ plus issue if we're talking about how extreme weather events, extreme hot, heat and cold affect the unhoused population in the world. You know as well as I do that LGBTQ plus youth are exponentially more likely to be unhoused and suffer disproportionate effects from the environment. And then even it's a democracy issue. The same people who are funded by polluters to run for public office and pass bills that are counter to the Sierra Club's agenda are also often the same people who are pushing really bad trans bills, bullying kids and threatening their lives, like has happened recently in my home state of Arkansas in our legislative session. So these issues intersect in so many ways. And I think it's just the kind of thing that they seem separate, but once we really realize that a lot of these issues are not just individual issues, that we are all one community pushing for justice, it's kind of a bona fide epiphany for a lot of folks, and we could really realize the power that we have.
It really is. Today when I was preparing for the show, I was doing some research and I ended up diving into some journal article that did an analysis of the impact of climate change on Harris County in Texas and looking at when they put that against same-sex couples, what they saw in terms of the impact. And they found that there was, in fact, a disproportionate effect on same-sex couples. And it went through because it was connected to socioeconomics. It was connected to disparate treatment. And then it went even further if you were looking at same-sex couples of color. And it was just fascinating how much there was there. But I don't think people immediately make that connection. So what kind of stuff is happening in the environmental space that you think is effective in bringing more queer people into this conversation? Because I think you're right. It's seen as a disparate conversation. And in fact, there's a lot going on. And I will also mention that the environmental movement historically is often perceived as a very white movement. So that also creates a barrier. Can you talk about how that's changing?
Well, in order to make it change, we have to, build some bridges and knock down some silos. Those are kind of cliche answers right there. But let me flesh them out a little bit more. I think we all want to build bridges and break down silos, but we need to understand that it doesn't happen accidentally. I'll tell you that. We have to be very purposeful. We have to be very intentional. And I think maybe even most importantly, we have to be very respectful when we're entering new communities that have not traditionally been doing the kind of work that Sierra Club's been doing. I think one of the things that probably my Sierra Club volunteers here in Arkansas are sick to death of hearing me say is that probably the worst thing that Sierra Club can do when entering a community that has not traditionally been environmentally active is to show up and say, hey, we're the Sierra Club and here's how you can help us, right? Right. That's not the way that we should do things. And that's really a mind shift for folks like me who's kind of grown up in a campaign movement and an advocacy movement. We're used to trying to win really fast and bring people on board as quickly as possible and achieve a goal. But if we're talking about building community and building relationships, it's exactly the opposite, right? It's a slower process. It's a more meaningful process. And it means showing up and asking, how can we help you, right? Instead of how can you help us? And it means it's showing up and supporting the efforts of groups, non-environmental groups, maybe the issues that they're working on. It means maybe not leading. It means maybe not being out in front, but maybe being in a support role, which is also very different than the way that I grew up learning how to campaign, And it means that the goal is not just strengthening our own organization, our own campaign, but also the larger goal is building more just communities. And so knowing that we all benefit from having communities that don't harm LGBTQ plus folks or don't allow police brutality, that don't pass laws that bully trans kids, if we understand that that benefits all of us, I think that can help us break down those silos, but we have to be very purposeful about it. And one thing that I'm really proud about is that, as you mentioned, historically, the environmental movement, and Sierra Club is certainly part of that, has been a wider, more hetero, skewing a little bit more older demographic. That's changing. And both in terms of our volunteer leaders and in terms of our staff over the last decade, we've been very intentional about doing the work and having the hard conversations about how we organize in our communities and how we work internally. And I'll admit, a hard truth is that this is bumpy, messy work for an organization like Sierra Club. It takes a lot of education. It takes a lot of hard conversation. It takes a lot of work. And we are not done, of course, because you're never done if you're doing it right. But I'm proud of where we've come. I've been at Sierra Club for 19 years now. And where we've come from before when I started to now on these kind of issues, and really being purposeful about the type of organizing, the type of work we do externally and internally has made a lot of difference. I'm proud of it, but I'm looking forward to seeing where we go.
There's something, as you talk about this, there's something that I keep thinking about, which is the role of making the case for people as to why this is so relevant. And while I hate to focus on the negative, do you think that the more expansive coverage of things that we've seen, like, frankly, the water situation in Flint, or what happened with the grid in Texas, that these examples are making people pay attention? Or do you think that some of this is becoming white noise? Because sometimes I think, well, this is the thing that's going to make people jump.
Yeah.
Sometimes they don't jump, and I wonder, is it just me? So do you think that's moving things, or are people starting to tune out again?
I think it's definitely moving things. And the reason it is because it's very easy, I think, to dismiss, global climate disruption or water issues or extreme weather events in places like New Jersey or other places that don't affect you personally, right? The sad part is that it's starting to affect everybody personally. No matter where you live in this country, you have to recognize, unless you're just willfully ignorant, that climate disruption is happening, that our winters are more severe, our storm events are more severe, our summers are hot, our water is changing, and things are unpredictable. And so I think people's, the scales are maybe falling from some folks' eyes, whether they want to or not. And they realize that climate change is not just something that's going to happen, it's happening now, and here are the results. And, people in coastal areas, they know it better than anybody else. Maybe they don't want to admit that it's actually what, Sierra Club and other folks have been warning about for 20 years, but they know that something's wrong and they know that something's changing. And so I think people are starting to get it. That's one good thing. But the other semi-sad thing as well is that as we're moving away from fossil fuels and we're moving to more solar and more wind and more electric cars and things like that, the thing that's helping to drive that as well is that people are starting to make money and people are starting to save money. And that's starting to move even some of our farther right folks and anti-climate science folks into the right category. I've often said, I don't really care why you do the right thing as long as you do the right thing. And so we're starting to see Republican legislators, even in my state to a certain extent, that are on board with solar, they're on board with wind, and they're on board with shutting down coal plants because it's starting to make more money for them and save ratepayer dollars in their communities.
Which I think, I don't care how you get to the right answer, as long as you get to the right answer eventually. And we knew that it was going to take making the case in a lot of ways. And we probably knew that when capitalism turned sort of in this direction, a lot of people were going to turn with it too, even if it's a little slower than we want it to be. Yeah. So I want to talk about, the article that we put up for people with Patagonia, the drag queen, was a really interesting one, because one of the things that she was talking about was the many ways that this actually shows up in activism. That for some people, it obviously is at the legislative level, but for some people, it's also going to be at the individual level. And she talked about some of those individual things, including things like switching to ethical banks, which I think is fascinating. So can we talk a little bit about these actions? Because it is Earth Day, and we always do promise people we're going to give stuff to do, because I'm really bossy and I like telling people what to do. So you can help me this week. Yeah. Let's tell people what to do. So can we talk about some of those everyday ways, sort of on the individual level? And then I also want to talk very briefly about, are there legislative things that people should be paying attention to? So for this Earth Day, what are your suggestions for people who are watching?
Well, the cliche that you hear every Earth Day is that everybody can do something. And that's true. It's 100% true. I like to take it a little further and say everybody can do more, right? You can always do more than what you're doing. And so, maybe you're a recycler, maybe you have an electric car, maybe you walk instead of drive when you can. Maybe you're doing these kind of things that are incredibly important and they make you feel like you're doing good works. I want you to try to do more. And let me share a secret with all the people who are watching the show that not a lot of people pay attention to. A lot of my work is around dealing with utilities and state environmental regulators and state power system regulators. And one secret that maybe not everybody pays attention to is the fact that most major utilities around the country, they have to invest and spend a certain amount of money every year in energy efficiency type work. And what I mean by that is they have to help their customers save energy. It's a requirement from their Public Service Commission. They get some incentives to do it, and they have some goals to hit. What that can mean for individual people that can maybe make a bigger difference for them than just recycling is most major utilities will do a free home energy audit for you if you just ask.
Huh.
Yeah, and so not out of the goodness of their heart, right? They're required to do it. But what that can mean for an individual homeowner or somebody who lives in an apartment or something, if you go and they'll come to your home, they will do, there's very different degrees of it, but they might test a lot of different things in your home, make some recommendations, and depending on the state you live in, they might do retrofits for free or for drastically reduced cost aimed at helping you save energy. So they can do everything from adding tons of insulation to your attic for free. They can give you energy efficiency light bulbs, special shower heads that use less water. There's a number of different things that can happen, and they'll make these recommendations for you. So it's really worth checking out if your utility does that, because it can save you a lot of money, and it can also make a lot of difference in the amount of energy your home uses. And I'll state the obvious, that when your home uses less energy, that is less that the power plant has to run and less pollution into our air and water. So that's my big hint of the day for Earth Day 2021. Call your utility and get a home energy audit. It makes a big difference.
I love that. And like what conversations you can get going while you're doing those audits too, and the things that you can pick up and learn. Thank you. I actually did not know that. And I think I'm going to pursue that one as somebody who lives in a very hot climate that's about to get very, very hot.
Right. Do everything you can.
I know that in our house, one of the biggest things that we talk about is the reduction of food waste, because there is a huge connection between reducing food waste. Only buy what you need, only buy what you know you're going to eat, because it reduces what we waste. It also reduces on the front end what we are doing. So any other suggestions? Now I want to talk about sort of at the legislative level. We know that I read this morning that President Biden is making big announcements on emissions right now, and that's going to have a huge impact. Are there any other things that people should be paying attention to? Because we've got a lot of people who want to do the right thing, and I would love to point them in the right direction of here's where you could be focusing some of your advocacy in a fully nonpartisan way. Yeah,
absolutely nonpartisan. We're a nonpartisan organization, for sure. I love small local initiatives, and a couple of them that I might bring to your viewers' attention that I think are really great. One of them is that there's a program that a lot of states and localities have adopted called PACE. It's an acronym, PACE, stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy. And so you mentioned, or folks talk about, hey, solar is so expensive. And it's coming down dramatically. Solar's dropped almost 90% over the last decade, which is amazing. But if you're faced sometimes with, hey, I don't have the ability to scratch out a check and pay for solar panels for my home. I'll find a way to do that. Well, if your state or your locality can create what's known as a PACE district, it's basically a way to get low cost financing for people to put solar panels or energy efficiency measures on their home. But the fun part of it is that it doesn't require you to put up any money. It requires basically your loan for your improvements is secured by your property taxes, right? And so that's your collateral. And so your property taxes will go up a little bit each year. And here's the fun part. If you decide to leave or sell your home and move, you don't carry that debt with you. It stays with the property. And so it's an enhancement to your home's value. And it's a way for more folks of modest means to really kind of step up and be part of the clean energy revolution. And even if they don't have the kind of money to just install solar on their own, which I think is a great thing. And we have several PACE districts in Arkansas, and, they require some work and some are better than others, but it's an opportunity for folks to really get into this solar business.
But I love that. It makes it accessible, because I do think there is a perception, and some of it is very much grounded in reality, that making some of these changes actually is very expensive. I have to apologize. I have military flyovers where I live. And that's what we're hearing right now. So I was wondering if Jamie can actually come back in, because I've noticed a couple of questions pop up in the side, and I know there was one that you had, Jamie, that I really loved, and I want to make sure that we get to.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with my question because I'm the host and I'm allowed to do stuff like that.
You get your prerogative. All right.
So, Glenn, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, the article that we highlighted this week was about an activist who, it seems a lot of their activism is happening in the digital space, in the digital world.
Sure.
And so I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the role that digital environmental activism is going to have now and in the future.
Well, it certainly has been a gigantic part for the past year, right? Because everybody's stuck in their home, and that's the activism that we're doing. My Arkansas state legislature has been in session, and it's not really been a safe space, I think, for my folks to go. We can't encourage our people to go down there. And so most of our activism has been on the phone or been online. I think that one of the things that's going to happen once COVID is in the rearview mirror is that a whole army of people who didn't have these kind of digital tools now have them, and maybe it's older folks who weren't used to doing this kind of technology, or organizations like Sierra Club that have really tried to figure out better ways to do it because we had to. And so I think digital is a huge part of it. It makes a difference in, pushing in comments, pushing in communications with your legislators and decision makers, but it's also just an amazing way to organize people and volunteers, so I think it can't be overstated the effect of digital. Now, as a 51-year-old man, I think there's nothing that can take the place of one-on-one conversations. I kind of come out of that Cesar Chavez school of organizing, where, you asked him how he did it, and he said, I talked to one person, and then I talked to another person, and then I talked to another person. Kind of the Sierra Club way is we use all the tools in our disposal to get people activated, but then we try to move them from online action to offline action, showing up in person and doing that, because, you can't hike digitally as much. It's not nearly as fun. We like to move a lot of people into the outdoors and be advocates too. So I think that's a great question to ask, Jamie. I think we've improved and we're only going to get better, but it's no substitute for the on the ground stuff that really needs to happen after the online engagement.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. Another question that came up in the chat, somebody was wondering if you have any suggestions about how we can all eat more sustainably while also, watching those finances, because it can get expensive to eat organic and sustainably.
Yeah, I think that that's an area that I have not done a lot of work in, but I think that ideally you want to try to eat as close to home as you can. And what I mean by that is your food doesn't have to travel as far, right? If your food doesn't have to travel as far, it doesn't need to be frozen or preserved. There's not all the pollution that comes in with trucking stuff across the world or across the nation. And so, meeting up and knowing your local farmers, meeting up and knowing your local restaurants and people who, do make that effort to provide food that is local. It's very hip, right, to say, is this chicken local or whatever. And it's very Portlandia. People like to talk about that, right, Jamie? But it's real too, and we talk about building relationships earlier in the program, is that it's fun to build relationships with your local farmer or your local restaurant, or somebody who your local butcher, if you're a meat eater. I mean, you get to know people who maybe aren't doing the same kind of things you do, and you're building that community that is so important to all the work that we've been discussing. So I don't have all the answers to that, but I think that buying as close to home as you can makes a big difference.
And Jamie, I just want to add one thing to that. I love what you said about buying local, Glenn, because that is true. The less it needs to travel, the smaller the footprint. The other thing is lots of vendors, especially local farmers and producers, have started doing selling ugly versions of their food. So the imperfect version of the banana, the mushrooms that are kind of misshapen, they taste the same. They're less expensive, but they're significantly less expensive. And it gives people a lot more access to stuff if you're just willing to eat ugly, because it kind of all looks the same after you eat it.
Right.
Not to be gross, but it's true.
So another question, and it's sort of a long one. Somebody was saying that they often see an influx of rainbow capitalism during the month of June, and that they're getting pretty good at sort of figuring out if those companies are actually walking the walk and not just talking the talk. and that they're starting to notice the same thing around Earth Day and around various environmental campaigns, seeing this green capitalism, if you will.
Yeah.
Glenn, do you know of any good ways, any good tools, any good resources that would help us all check into whether companies are actually walking that walk and have environmentally sustainable practices?
Yeah, what a great question, because even before I got onto the program here, I was wading through my inbox just clogged with Earth Day emails from various companies and so forth. And some of them you just have to laugh about the stretch that they had to make to connect their product somehow to Earth Day. There's a lot of different ways to kind of keep up. Common sense is one of them, right? You got to keep your head straight and know that not everybody is doing great things for the Earth. I might point us to one thing that I think is a little more in my wheelhouse that is helpful. I do a lot of utility work, as I mentioned. And so your power company at this time of year often likes to talk about how green they are. And it's not always true, and you've seen lots and lots of utilities across the country, especially the larger ones, making these utility climate pledges saying we're going to be completely zero carbon by 2050 or some date certain. Sierra Club put out a report in the last couple months called The Dirty Truth About Utility Climate Pledges. And I'd encourage everybody to just look it up, Dirty Truth About Climate Pledges. And what it did was compare the pledges that your local utilities and your big utilities have been making about how green they're going to be, and comparing it with their actual plans that they had to file with regulators about what they're actually going to do. And maybe not surprisingly, that kind of report showed that most of the utilities around the country that have made climate pledges were coming up with actions that were entirely counter to their climate pledges. So you have to do a little bit of research to find out, look past the promise and see what they're actually doing. And I'm really finding that report is useful if you're involved with utility integrated resource planning processes, which is how they say, here's what we're going to do for the next 20 years. Waving my report around and saying, you said this, but this is what you're doing is a great way to get people's attention and maybe get them on the right track. So that's one thing that I would recommend to your viewer. Check out the Dirty Truth About Utility Climate Pledges report from Sierra Club.
Perfect. Thank you. Now, I think this is going to be the last question we get to, and it's mine again. Jean Marie made some jokes about hugging trees, and Glenn, you made some jokes about Portlandia and eating local.
Just one.
Do you have any recommendations for anybody who wants to sort of break that idea that environmentalists are automatically going to be sort of hippy dippy? Because anybody who likes to be outdoors, whether that's fishermen or sportsmen or anybody that likes to be outdoors should care about these issues. So do you have any recommendations for sort of breaking that stereotype that folks might have?
Yeah, I think that's right in my wheelhouse. I've lived in the South my entire life, and I'm surrounded by just absolute breathtaking beauty in my state. We have 52 state parks, 3 national forests, a national river. It's a great place to live and recreate, and people and when I started working for Sierra Club in Arkansas, half the people would say, "What's Sierra Club?" and the other half would be just kind of amazed that I looked like a normal person, quote unquote, And so, you kind of break down those barriers just by talking to people, but then you find those areas in common, in red states where people, in my state, people who care about the land, say they're farmers or they're hunters or fisher persons, they don't like to call themselves environmentalists, but they will call themselves conservationists because it's a real virtue signal for them to their community. And when I have the opportunity to talk to people in my state about these kind of things, I ask them where they hunt, or I ask them where they fish, and do they care about the clean water and the healthy forests that they want to operate in? Where do you farm? What do you farm? Do you farm? What kind of pesticides do you use? A lot of people are not using so much pesticides anymore because they care about the land and the food. Oftentimes, I'm not the right messenger to have this conversation, but I might bring in some faith leaders, to talk about creation and stewardship. Every major faith tradition has a stewardship angle to it. And once we start figuring out those areas in common and getting to build those relationships that we've been talking about throughout the program, it really makes a big difference in the way people perceive. It's hard to hate on somebody that right? And that has a name. And this is exactly the kind of work that I know that your groups have been doing too. If it's easy to demonize a group, it's harder to demonize Glenn or Jean Marie or Jamie, right? If you know those people. And that's what really all this work is about. It's about building communities and figuring out what we have in common and really moving the needle forward and getting past these groups that profit by dividing us and profit in terms of political power and money. There's no reason in the world environmentalism should be thought of as some sort of wacky liberal issue. We all breathe, we all drink water, hopefully, and we all want to visit beautiful places. So that's our mission. That's what we're about. And we want to partner with anybody who is working for justice in any way and build better communities for all of us.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate the chance. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jamie. And thank you, Glenn. This was great. I will stop making my tree hugging jokes. And this is when I admit that I own more pairs of Birkenstocks that I probably should admit to people on TV. But please pay attention to what's going on around you. Pay attention to the legislation and pay attention to the changes that you can make, because we are all responsible for this conversation. I want to leave us with something from Arkansas, which is the female poet, Carl Wilson Baker wrote, "Today I've grown taller from walking with the trees." I think we all have that opportunity every single day to notice what's around us and how we can help preserve it or make it even safer. So let's do that. Next week, we're going to be having a really important conversation, and that's actually going to start in Arkansas again, about some of that really hideous anti-trans legislation that's happening. So make sure that you're with us for that conversation. But until then, I left my mask somewhere. Please keep wearing your mask when it is appropriate, which is most of the time. Get yourself vaccinated and continue to run fast, laugh hard, and be kind. And we will see you again next Thursday on Something to Talk About. Thanks, everybody. Bye.